some people were shocked that I so directly and aggressively said, look, arguments for veganism that are based on superstition, arguments for veganism that are based on Buddhist tradition basically have to go. It's game over. That has nothing to do with what we're doing now and in the future in the vegan movement. This has nothing to do with political veganism, ecological veganism, ethical veganism, or even health-based veganism. You know, the plant-based diet people, or, you know, reducing your chances of heart attack, reducing your cholesterol. We have to draw a very clear line between past, present, and future, and the future of veganism in China, the future of veganism for Chinese people living in Canada, California, and Australia. The future of veganism is not going to be nostalgia for the superstition of the feudal past.
在世界上，我们有佛教徒从来不吃肉，但是他们的主义是生气的思想方法，就是封建制度的主义。在现代科学界证明，我们不需要为了身体健康吃动物的东西。在古代，人不可能知道他们可不可能吃纯素，因为我们现在知道你可能一直有这个生活方式，所以这个伦理的问题变成一个政治税的问题。
À-bas-le-ciel.
That's my new best friend in the background there. You see that? Oh, with the dough hook. The dough hook on. That's what we call a stand mixer in the baking industry. Anyway, it's my new robot friend taking up the backdrop in this video. I got some fan mail from a supporter on Patreon, and he's an English-speaking guy who's currently living in China. He wrote to me about the difficulty of being vegan in China and the inspiration he took from my channel in different ways. So I'm guessing he's partly inspired by the stuff about vegan activism and veganism as an ethical cause, and partly just the videos that talked about coping with life in China, learning Chinese as a language, and that sort of thing. Anyway, he wrote to me, I wrote back to him. He's supporting me on Patreon for $1 a month. You should too. I'll answer your emails, and I'll make videos responding to your questions. He wrote back again with a question. Basically, he seemed to be asking me about how optimistic he should be about making a positive impact through community activism in Chinese, with Chinese as the language, when he returns to the Western world. He asks me how optimistic I am, in effect, about my ability to make a positive difference in promoting veganism in the Chinese language for a Chinese-speaking audience here in Canada. We could say Canada or the United States, for that matter. So this is an interesting topic, and I was tempted to discuss it just 2 or 3 videos ago. The video about Ken Savior in response to this satirical take on vegan activism on the continent of Asia. Why was I tempted to do it there? The interesting thing is, I mean, you have a bit of a Coles to Newcastle phenomenon if you're preaching veganism in Asian cultures that already have a set of expectations attached to vegetarianism, if not veganism, right? So to talk about veganism in a Hindu context, to talk about veganism in a Buddhist context, to talk about veganism even just in a context where culturally people are already familiar with some of these core ideas because of many centuries of Buddhist or Hindu background, it is a very different thing from introducing it as an original idea, I don't know, to people in Northern California, where it doesn't have these expectations attached to it. So in a lot of ways, you know, if you're a white Western person presenting veganism to a Chinese audience, you have a more difficult task than I think if you were arguing for veganism, let's say in a Muslim setting. It would be very, very different. Conceptually, I mean, this is a real example. When I was in Taiwan, Taiwan has the strongest vegan culture of any country in the world. It really does. It's amazing just how much veganism there is there. But when you tell people you're vegan in that part of the world, they assume you believe in ghosts. is very common in Taiwan. If you tell people that you're vegan, they believe you're the sort of superstitious person who goes and venerates the ghosts of your ancestors, your deceased grandparents, and this sort of thing. That you're someone who actually makes decisions in your life that are based on, in 2 words, hocus pocus. And in Taiwan, that is incredibly commonly seen. I lived surrounded by people making burnt offerings to the ghosts. I could say burnt offerings to the gods, but I think in most cases it was this sort of animism. Stacking up huge piles of fake money to venerate the dead. Elaborate rituals, most of which involved lighting things on fire. Sometimes they involved hurling things into the ocean. This kind of symbolic sacrifice. These are mainstream, powerful beliefs and cultural assumptions in Taiwanese society, and they shape the conceptualization of veganism and the reception of veganism. Now, look, how easy is it to instead argue for veganism in Iraq in 2018? I have zero experience living or working in Iraq, but I can say that you're at least starting from a blank sheet of paper, and you're starting from the assumption that veganism is a new, modern, predominantly Western idea, and it's then an idea you're probably going to debate or discuss largely in terms of science, in terms of ecology. Ecology is ultimately rooted in the sciences, in terms of health, and in terms of ethics, but a very modern and scientistic form of ethics. The appraisal of the significance of animal suffering or animals being put through these terrible situations on factory farms for to produce food that's unnecessary and unhealthy, et cetera, et cetera. That's very, very different from stepping into a conversation with somebody for whom the core message of veganism is something they're already familiar with, or something they think they're already familiar with, and where they probably feel about it the same way an American person would feel about Jehovah's Witnesses, the same way you might feel about street preachers at the airport, or going door to door, or standing on the street corner with a Bible preaching to you that the end of the world is going to come. In a Chinese context, mainland China, the Chinese from places, overseas Chinese as they call from places like Malaysia and Taiwan, really veganism in that sense, you start off with it sounding tired and overly familiar for the wrong reasons. It's something that people in general are not going to be eager to hear again, and you presenting the case for it are burdened with those expectations. Now, above and beyond that, there's maybe an expectation. So in my case, it's very peculiar. I was a scholar of Buddhism for more than 10 years. I actually do have tremendous expertise in Buddhism. I have peer-reviewed publications to prove that. I have a long, strange track record of travel and lectures I've delivered and so on to prove that. I can present arguments for veganism in a Buddhist context or in a uniquely Chinese cultural context that addresses or tries to make use of that situation. And I choose not to. I do not argue for veganism as a scholar of Buddhism. You can watch a lot of videos on this channel discussing why that is. On the contrary, the only video on this channel where I'm talking about veganism in Chinese, in my own voice, it's not translated by someone else, where I'm making the case for it. I instead try to really disambiguate modern Western ecological and ethical veganism. Veganism as I know it, veganism I preach it. I try to completely disambiguate that, disentangle it from the Chinese superstitious tradition. So I have a couple of videos now talking about that. We say, look, you cannot think of this in terms of the old religious ideas that separate spiritually clean food from spiritually unclean food, that are based on ideas of spiritual pollution coming from these foods. No, it's not about spiritual pollution. It's about actual pollution. It's about ecological pollution. It's not about whether or not you will be reincarnated in a good situation or a bad situation. It's not about the ghosts of your dead ancestors. I really have to strenuously argue for the idea that veganism is something important in itself and of itself. And again, if you're talking about a Chinese market, a Chinese audience, The question you have to ask is, why would they want to hear it from me? Why would I be the guy to deliver that message? Why would I have any credence or credibility? Why would my voice matter? And by the way, I can answer those questions really positively about Buddhist scholarship. It's actually very easy. I've done this. It's very easy for me to walk into a room. It's very easy for me to walk into a Buddhist monastery and get an audience on my wavelength and say, hey, I'm a white person. I was born outside of Buddhism, and this is how I got involved. This is how I became a scholar of it. Here's the message I have to deliver to you. I really am quite capable of being a charismatic preacher for Buddhism as a philosophy, if not Buddhism as a religion, and explaining to people why it is I have a unique and well-informed message that they should pay attention to when they, as Chinese people, already have access to a wealth of Buddhist preachers. It's not like I'm the only person who they could be listening to or paying attention to on these matters. So yeah, it's a very, very tough sell. And the other thing you have to remember is, we're talking here specifically about the overseas Chinese community. They are not a random sampling of the people you will meet in mainland China. The people who choose to leave China and come to Vancouver, who choose to leave China and come to Canada, have very specific motivations for doing so, have very specific opportunities for doing so. You'll have a much more positive experience dealing with, say, the average man in Kunming, in mainland China, basically any normal city in mainland China. You're not looking at this peculiar self-selected minority who pack up their lives and get on an airplane, either expecting to never go home again or to go home only for brief visits. So growing up in Canada, growing up in Toronto, I didn't realize the extent to which the Chinese people I was meeting in Toronto were not in any way representative of the normal China or of the broad spectrum of Chinese culture. That I was meeting a very particular type of Chinese person who migrated to Toronto and who also was successful after they migrated to Toronto, because some people migrate and fail and they go back, of course. This is a very peculiar self-selected minority, and they will often have, very, shall we say, hardened attitudes towards the culture they chose to depart from. They may have come to really negative conclusions about Chinese culture in terms of modern politics. They may have chosen to leave China because they're really dissatisfied with the government and politics as they exist today. They may have chosen to leave China because they're very dissatisfied with traditionalism, put it that way, traditional Chinese culture, traditional Chinese religion, which is true of many people who choose to leave a Western country and migrate to another country also. It may be in part a rejection of the values and norms that they've grown up with, in that country. And then on the flip side of that, you also have Chinese immigrants who are hyper-traditionalist, who left China hoping to recapture those roots or hoping to preserve them, who go to Canada and who actually very much want to recreate an idea they have in their own mind of what traditional Chinese culture is supposed to be, and who are really hoping to inculcate those values in the next generation. Although that's a minority, they're a highly visible minority, especially if you go out to the suburbs of Toronto. If you go to a Chinese community center or Chinese Buddhist temple, you do meet that vocal minority of Chinese who've left the country, but who've resolved to, in a sense, be as traditionalistic as possible. So in all of these situations, I have to say, the questions you need to ask yourself are the same fundamental questions I tell my colleagues again and again to ask yourself when doing humanitarian work. What do you have to offer? People ask me for advice all the time. No, not every week, but often enough. People ask me for advice about buying an airplane ticket and going to do humanitarian work somewhere in Asia. Normally it's Asia they ask me about, whether it's Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, or other parts of Asia. And one of the first issues I have to press them is, you need to sit down and ask yourself, what do you have to offer? If you're a dentist, the answer may be very simple. You're going there to provide dentistry to people who otherwise wouldn't have access to dentistry. I remember meeting a guy, and he had quite an interesting humanitarian career simply as a plumber. His area of expertise was in plumbing, and he went to disaster zones where hurricanes had just destroyed all the plumbing and infrastructure, and he did humanitarian work providing plumbing to refugee camps, that kind of thing. I think also repairing plumbing for normal cities, this sort of thing. That was his form of humanitarian work, so he had something very specific to offer. But why does your voice matter? How can you actually help people? What do you have to offer? And then how are those people going to perceive you? You know, if you're something like a dentist or a plumber, if there's something specific there you have to offer, they may perceive you in those terms for better or worse, right? Who naturally is going to care about their dentist's opinion about veganism, animal rights, ethics, and ecology? They could be more dismissive of you for that reason, even though they respect you as a dentist. Who is necessarily going to care about the plumber's opinion about veganism? It's a very strange province we're into here in terms of public morality, public intellectual discourse, and politics. Why is it that some voices emerge in a way that's respected and not others? But I can tell you one thing. For the Chinese market, maybe I'm wrong, but here's my bet. You are never going to make progress by being emotionally anguished, over the top, the way Joey Carbstrong sometimes is in the street, the way Earthling Ed is. You are never going to make progress by walking up to a stranger and telling them on the street that they're wearing a fur coat or that their hood is low. You are never going to get there through showing how emotionally overwhelmed you are by the suffering of animals, by making pleas for compassion. Of course, it's interesting because both on the Buddhist side and in a different sense on the Confucian side, you can argue that the whole edifice of Chinese civilization and culture, the whole religious tradition, really is about compassion in many ways. But in the same way that if you grew up Christian, it doesn't make you more susceptible to hearing those Christian tropes. It makes you more standoffish and leery. And if someone walks up to you in the street and is telling you stuff that's familiar from your whole childhood experience growing up Protestant in a small town in the southern United States, you're probably more reluctant to hear those moral arguments when they're applied to veganism. In the same way, you have what I call a Coles to Newcastle phenomenon, where the Chinese, broadly speaking, because they're familiar with a lot of these tropes and these ideals, they're even more reluctant to think of them as something novel and new that they should maybe consider or reconsider as possibly having a very positive role in their own lives and a positive role in the future of society. So guys, I'll give you a link below this video and you can see my attempt to deal with this in my earlier video. Some people were shocked that I so directly and aggressively said, look, arguments for veganism that are based on superstition, arguments for veganism that are based on Buddhist tradition basically have to go. It's game over. That has nothing to do with what we're doing now and in the future in the vegan movement. This has nothing to do with political veganism, ecological veganism, ethical veganism, or even health-based veganism. You know, the plant-based diet people, or, you know, reducing your chances of heart attack, reducing your cholesterol. We have to draw a very clear line between past, present, and future, and the future of veganism in China, the future of veganism for Chinese people living in Canada, California, and Australia. The future of veganism is not going to be nostalgia for the superstition of the feudal past.
À-bas-le-ciel.